My first guest tonight is Galen Druk. He is the host and producer of the Politics Podcast 538, based in New York City. Galen, it's good to see you again. We know that the president, he had to hit the ground running in terms of responding to the pandemic. What kind of grades are Americans giving him for that?
Well, addressing the coronavirus pandemic is one of his strongest points with the American public. So overall, about 60% of Americans approve of the job he's doing addressing the coronavirus pandemic. That's quite high, especially considering that we have really high rates of partisan polarization in the United States. So if you look at his approval overall, his approval rating is about 54% today on his 100th day, and about 42% of Americans disapprove. So you can see from that overall more Americans think he's doing well on addressing the coronavirus pandemic than approve of him overall. And of course, that probably has a lot to do with the fact that Republicans and Democrats are just divided on practically everything these days.
Well, where is his approval rating not as strong?
You know, one of the areas where his approval rating is not as strong is immigration, for example. That's become a hot button issue that divides the parties pretty intensely, and there's not a lot of common ground at this point between Republicans and Democrats on that. You know, another area is gun policy. Of course, we have seen various high-profile mass shootings in the United States over the past several weeks. Democrats have been pretty adamant about wanting to pass new gun restrictions. Republicans don't seem at all interested. And so that's another place that, you know, these hot button issues that people already have, you know, clear cut positions on, it's going to be really difficult, if maybe impossible, for Biden to really pick up support in those areas. But on things like the economy, the coronavirus, jobs, things like that, he's doing significantly better.
The president last night, you know, he gave his first speech before Congress, and he gave the argument why this, $6 trillion in spending on these transformative policies, why it would be worth every cent. Is President Biden, is he in a position to deliver on what he's promising?
That's a good question. So about $2 trillion of his plan has already been passed into law. That was the American Rescue Plan, and that was framed as an urgent response to the coronavirus pandemic. Now he has another $2 trillion that he wants to spend on infrastructure, which addresses both infrastructure but also climate change issues and some social programs. And then there's another $2 trillion, which he's calling the American Families Plan, which is more social programs, childcare, universal pre-K, funding for education, and so on. So at this point, he has passed one $2 trillion bill and is trying to pass two other $2 trillion each bills. Yeah. It looks like some of the moderates in the Senate, in the Democratic Party, are skeptical of that much spending and will be pushing back. You know, that could end up, out of the $4 trillion remaining, maybe that ends up closer to $2 trillion, maybe it ends up closer to $3 trillion. But at this point, he does not need Republican support, really, to pass that remaining $4 trillion. So he's really dealing with members of his own party and persuading them that they should pass this, remaining $4 trillion package.
When he was a candidate for the office of the presidency, Biden talked a lot about healing and bringing a divided country together. Do you think there's been real progress there?
Well, Republicans would tell you no. In general, he has governed as a much more normal president than President Trump did, of course. He's not on Twitter all the time. And he practices a politics that is more conciliatory towards the Republican Party and towards Republican voters. And so he'll very frequently reach out to Republican voters and say, look at all of these Republicans who support some of my plans. If you look at the polling, lower income Republicans, the majority of them favored the American Rescue Plan. So he is getting support from sections of the Republican Party. When it comes to actually Republican lawmakers, there's relatively little unity there, but at least there is not the same kind of mudslinging that we saw during the Obama and Trump administrations so far. Remember, it's only been 100 days, and typically in a president's first 100 days, they experience something of a honeymoon.
Galen Druk with the Podcast 538. Galen, we appreciate your time. We appreciate you crunching the numbers for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Well, we have complete coverage tonight. With me tonight is a veteran of the Obama campaigns, Julius von der Laar. Julius knows President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. He is now a campaign strategy consultant here in Berlin. Also joining me is DW's Carolina Chamoy. She is on assignment in the state of Texas to both of you. It's good to have you with us. Julius, let me start with you. One of the spoils of being president is that you get to construct the narrative when you give a speech like this. So let's dissect this a little bit. As a European, what did you hear as Biden's main message last night?
I mean, he said America's on the move again. And I thought he made a compelling case that, he brought America back. First of all, of course, shots in arms, 220 million shots into America's arms. I thought that was a helpful, just marker that he laid down. The other thing, of course, is that no president in history has ever created that many jobs in the first 100 days of his office. But as a European, I think there was also a message in there that was still an America First message. And we saw it over the last 100 days that Joe Biden, of course, has put America first. And I think we in Europe have also noticed that.
I want us to stay here with the notion of foreign policy. I want you to take a listen to what former U.S. President Donald Trump said about Biden's foreign policy, in particular his policy on China, in an interview on Fox News. Take a listen.
They're going to give our country away to China. China will take over this country if they don't do something very quickly, and they've been very, very weak on China. We beat China so badly, and then COVID came along, and it was back to step one.
Now, Julius, there are obviously problems with the truth there and what the former president is saying, but despite that, there are people who will not buy Biden's tough stance on China. How do you get through to those people?
Well, I thought he laid out a specific example in the second part of the speech when he said, I don't see why we should be producing wind turbines or why we should actually purchase any of those wind turbines in China when we can actually build them in Texas or in Pennsylvania or in West Virginia. And I thought that was a compelling case that he continued to say, well, we got to purchase in America, but we also got to build in America. And I think the way to sell that is to actually say this all has to do with American jobs and American infrastructure, and we can't rely on the Chinese anymore. We got to buy and purchase at home.
Yeah, that takes us to domestic policy and to you, Carolina. Biden last night called for an end to America's war on immigration. So what's his solution to the crisis at America's southern border?
Indeed, Brent, he called to end that war on immigration here in the United States, but he did not really address the crisis here in the southern border, the border to Mexico. He instead called on Congress to pass this immigration bill, a bill that includes a path to citizenship for around 11 million undocumented people. And this issue, the southern border crisis, has really overshadowed his first 100 days in office. So people were expecting him to address this. Instead of that, he traveled today to Atlanta. Tomorrow, he is going to be in Philadelphia. And it's not in his plans to come to the southern border by now. We have been talking to people here. And for example, helpers, they expect President Biden to address a more humane immigration policy. That is exactly what he promised. And also the ones who are not for immigration, the ones who live here at the border, who have this wall on their backyard, they expect him to have a regulated form of immigration. That means they're not against immigrants, but they want them to come in and regulated in a legal way. Let's take a look to the report we did yesterday.
Family Barrera lives at the U.S. border next to Mexico and Texas. Lately, they have seen more and more immigrants arriving on the U.S. side. Many of them cross their front yard and even knock on their door.
They come and knock, like asking where they're at, what area they're at, they bar phones, water, food, anything in any way that they could get help. It's scary because of the fact that one could get into problems. Another one, how we say, we don't know who they are.
Once a week, they get to the other side of the wall, to the river. Fishing in the Rio Grande, the natural border between Texas and Mexico, has been a tradition in their family for generations. There, they enjoy a beautiful landscape and a peaceful activity at a river that for many on the other side looks dangerous and life-changing.
Cuando estaba Trump, se miraba menos. Mirábamos nosotros menos.
With Trump, we saw less people crossing the border. Since Biden, there are more. My parents, they are from Mexico, so I do understand them. But we just can't help. We can't do anything for them.
Tanto y esto, no podemos hacer más por ellos.
Helping undocumented immigrants is against the law in the U.S. Helpers can even get arrested. Many of the people who cross the river are from Central America. They escape from life-threatening situations at home, where criminal activities are part of everyday life. For many, paying a coyote to get to the U.S. is their only option. Clothes on the ground show where they crossed the river, and wristbands mark their path.
From here, it's only a 5 to 10 minutes ride to cross the Rio Grande. The river gets really narrow here. This is why around 700 immigrants cross the river from Mexico to the United States seeking asylum every day, especially during the night. According to the U.S. Custom and Border Protection, this number is going to increase during the next months. A huge challenge for President Biden, who has promised a more humane immigration policy.
Instead, the streets in Roma are packed with National Guard, state troopers, and police officers. Thousands of immigrants have been arriving every month in a city of roughly 12,000 residents. The mayor is concerned. He knows the number is most likely going to increase.
We're on their side as far as we understand why, but at the same time, we wish that there was a better way for them to come across, a more legal way. And I think that's going to entail immigration reform for a better policy, because right now an open border type situation is not the safest for anybody.
An everyday concern for people like the Barrera family, who know there is not an easy solution. They just want freedom and to live without fear, just like the ones who cross the border.
Carolina, your report speaks to the fact that there have been countless fruitless attempts by both Republican and Democratic presidents to reform immigration law in the U.S. Is there any reason to believe that it will be different with Joe Biden?
The thing, Brent, is that they need the Republicans on the board for that. And that is exactly the problem. The Democrats, as you know, have a razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives. They don't have a majority in the Senate, but a tie-breaking vote with Vice President Kamala Harris. So the question is, how can you get Republicans to support his immigration policy, his humane immigration policies? And that is a very difficult point, especially because, as you know, migration is not a popular issue. It divides people, it divides America, it divides Texas. That's what we have been noticing here. And with view to the midterm elections, this is of course not a popular, not a good issue for Joe Biden to address.
Julius, let me bring this back over here to us here in Germany and to climate change. And I have to ask you about the Green Party. They could win big in the election here in Germany in September. The next German chancellor could be a 40-year-old Green Party co-leader, and she will have a lot in common in terms of policy with the 78-year-old moderate Joe Biden.
That's right. And I mean, I think it's remarkable to see what's happening over here in Germany. I mean, for the first time in 16 years, the name on the ballot is not going to be Angela Merkel again. I mean, there's exactly 150 days to go until German election day. And you mentioned the polls right now. The Greens are in the lead. I think there's still a lot of runway for the CDU to continue to come back. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. Germany is facing some of the same issues to determine how to bring back the economy, how to get ready for climate change. And I think what the Green Party has laid out so far is that they also want to spend big, not just on the economy, but also on green technology and green jobs. And I think that's one path forward for both Joe Biden, as he laid out yesterday, but also for Annalena Baerbock and the Green Party.
Yeah, I think we can say tonight that Joe Biden would have no problems with having a green government here in Germany. Julius van der Laar here in Berlin, and Carolina Chamoy, our correspondent in Texas tonight. To both of you, thank you. Well, as I said, one of the spoils of being president is getting to set the narrative. My next guest is a veteran in deciphering and dissecting presidential and political narratives. Frank Sesno is a former White House correspondent and former CNN Washington bureau chief. He is now with the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Frank, it's good to see you again. It's good to have you on the show again. What about this president? Last night, he presented his blue-collar blueprint for 21st century America. He obviously has superb speechwriters. Does he have a message to ensure that his plans become law?
Well, he doesn't have a plan to ensure that they're going to become law because they have to get through that 50-50 Senate and plenty of other hurdles. But that he's got the plans at all and that he's articulating them in this way, as you indicated, is a very, very big deal. Joe Biden, in 100 days, has carved out a narrative around his president that is as every bit as ambitious as LBJ or Franklin Roosevelt before him. You know, I covered, you mentioned I was a White House correspondent. I covered Ronald Reagan. I remember when Ronald Reagan brought the Republican Revolution, the Reagan Revolution, to Washington. He remade Washington in a conservative image, and he affected generations of presidencies after that, such that when Bill Clinton was president, he famously stood before that same Congress where Biden was last night, only with Clinton it was full, and he said the era of big government is over. A Democrat, Bill Clinton, said that. Last night, Joe Biden said the opposite. $6 trillion of federal spending in his various packages that have either been passed, the $1.9 trillion passed, or envisioned. A role for the federal government that no Democrat has really dared speak, certainly from that dais, since the time of Lyndon Johnson. And so this is a very, very dramatically different time. And though Joe Biden is speaking softly, he's carrying a very big government stick. And I think everybody is still coming to terms with this.
Yeah, and, you know, he's being compared a lot with LBJ and with FDR. But based on what you're saying, it sounds like maybe he's becoming, and he may not want to get this label, but he's becoming the anti-Ronald Reagan. Is that correct?
Yeah, in some ways, because what Reagan did and the way he influenced the party, and even in some ways through Donald Trump, although Trump departed very dramatically from much of Reagan's style. But the Republican Party since the time of Reagan has been a government is the problem party. That's what Reagan himself famously said in one of his State of the Union addresses to Congress. Government isn't the solution to your problems. Government is the problem. What Joe Biden is saying very clearly is whether it's climate change or infrastructure or education, which in the United States is a hyper-local issue, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's education, which he proposes to almost, overhaul. The government not only can make a difference, but should make a difference. So it is the anti-Reagan position. You know, we've had candidates who've run away from the L word, liberal, or have not wanted to be progressives because of this, the growth of the conservative movement. It started with Reagan. Maybe Biden will change that. We'll see. His poll numbers aren't overwhelming, but they're solid and they're in the, in positive territory.
Let me ask you a little bit about foreign policy. The threat from China was omnipresent in last night's speech, and the meta-narrative, if you will, was the Cold War. Do you agree with that? I mean, were we getting hints of another Cold War?
Well, I think what Biden is trying to do, and Trump did it in his own way before that, is to say that China is the 21st century. In Trump's word, threat or enemy, in Biden's word, competitor or adversary. So Biden tones the volume down, the temperature down a little bit, but his fundamental narrative is the same. China is who we need to worry about, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's climate change, whether it's economic competition, whether it's espionage. So, yes, I think that we've got China as the framing device of where the competition lies. And what Biden was saying very directly last night is that, the money that he wants to spend in infrastructure and climate change is jobs and is a way to counter China's influence. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that is galvanizing force that he needs. This is not the Cold War really drove policy, and it was said that, politics stopped at the water's edge. Yeah. Both parties agreed about how to go after the Cold War. They don't about how to go after China.
All right. Frank Sesno, as always, Frank, it's good to get your insights. We appreciate your time tonight. Frank Sesno joining us tonight from Washington, D.C. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
When Joe Biden moved into the White House last January, he had a portrait of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt placed prominently in the Oval Office. In the last few weeks, Washington, D.C. has begun comparing President Biden to FDR. President Roosevelt is best known for the New Deal. There's dozens of government agencies, including Social Security, established in 1933 to lift the U.S. out of the Great Depression. The New Deal transformed America, re-engineering the relationship between the people and the government, and it was a product of FDR's first 100 days in office. Last night, President Biden touted his own new deals: COVID-19 relief, modernizing infrastructure, and boosting America's middle class with investments in education and child care. The total price tag, $6 trillion. Historians say this easily surpasses the cost of the programs FDR put into place in his first 100 days. So, are we witnessing a new transformational president at work? Well, what we can see is a president trying to redefine the role of the state in the lives of its citizens. And there is an historical ebb and flow that Biden is tapping into. In his 1961 inauguration speech, President John F. Kennedy described the government as an ally of the people, an ally the people should gladly serve. Take a listen.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Yeah, a partnership between the people and their government. 20 years later, another president, Ronald Reagan, began the official dismantling of that partnership. Now, this is the line that we remember most from Reagan's inauguration speech in 1981.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Government as problem. For the next 40 years, Republicans and Democrats would trade tenures at the White House, but this paradigm stuck. It had various names, such as small government or trickle-down economics, the belief that tax breaks for the wealthy would free up capital, and that entrepreneurs would then create new jobs benefiting or trickling down to the middle class and the poor. In 2021, the middle class is smaller, the gap between rich and poor wider. And this is where President Biden comes in.
My fellow Americans, trickle down. Trickle-down economics has never worked, and it's time to grow the economy from the bottom and the middle out.
Well, whether Biden will transform America like a 21st century FDR, that remains to be seen. We do know this: Joe Biden, the oldest of presidents, embodies a notion of governance that is completely foreign to America's youth. The idea that the government is an ally of the public, that the government can be, should be part of the solution, not the problem.